It seems that one of the single biggest rules updates of 10th edition is just around the corner, with Games Workshop releasing a new detachment for every single faction in the game. Let's talk about the news and what we know so far. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the news of Games Workshop's grotsmas advent calendar, which this year, rather than showing us little bits of rumour engines and things, we're going to be getting a massive amount of Warhammer 40k content drip-fed over the entire month of December, and that's coming after we have a new balance update as well. This news is coming from Games Workshop's World Champion of Warhammer previews, this one giving us a look at some rather awesome new Krieg and Eldari miniatures. Loads of cool stuff there that I covered in the last video, but as a rather unexpected news bombshell they just randomly dropped, they basically unveiled that after perhaps a surprisingly long time of no codex updates or releases, they were going to have a great big content drop for Warhammer 40k, with at least something new and interesting for every single faction in the game. All in all, it should be a pretty massive shake-up. There might be some strong rules that might be good ways to play a new army, and hopefully a whole bunch of stuff that can add theme to other ways to play that they haven't really explored yet out of the codexes and the ones to come. So far we had a couple of hints that this was going to be the case. They'd had a bunch of rules teasers that said that there was a balance update that was going to be happening this year, including a balanced data slate. They promised Deathwatch standalone army rules for December. And then we had the World Champions of Warhammer FAQ that said they were dropping updates, potentially both November and December, which was kind of interesting to word it that way. My first take was that they probably just weren't sure when the balanced data slate was coming out. But now with the news that we're getting both a balance update and also the great big run of new detachments coming, it now almost implies that we might get the balanced data slate even sooner than most people were expecting. If there is indeed something coming out in November, I guess that could even be next week. Though certainly expect the major rules updates to drop sometime within the next 4 or so. In any case, looks like the balanced data slate update is separate to the Deathwatch Index drop. They're not going to be at the same time. The other hint that we had was that the Advent engine was not going to be happening this year. In several previous years they've given us sneak peeks as to various miniatures that are coming out. Kind of fun little things in themselves. Occasionally you can identify a part that looks like it's part of one given faction. Say for example we had the Astra Militarum Regimental Standard Bearer, the one that just got revealed for the Death Corps of Krieg. That was in last year's Advent engine and gave us a little hint as to what was coming, but often you can't really be sure and they can surprise you. When they said that they were pulling that and replacing it with something else this year, my hopes really weren't high, to be honest. I was expecting something maybe a little bit cutesy, maybe some red gobbo art or that little storyline that they seem to do throughout Christmas. Occasionally they've done some fun lore things in the past, and if they were going to do rules I would have guessed them to be split out amongst their various different gaming systems. And if they did things for Warhammer 40k, probably put them as Legends datasheets as opposed to anything that would affect the mainline game. But it does seem that I was completely mistaken on that. It seems they've chosen to use their advent calendar to deliver really quite an interesting update to every single faction in the game, certainly far more important than I would have suspected. Before we jump into the core details of the update, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Futureproof Modular Terrain. They've got a Kickstarter running at the moment, linked down in the video description, a follow-on and update to their previous one, which was recently very successfully funded. The idea of their terrain set is that it's basically sort of like ruined terrain bits, but kind of working like Lego or building blocks. You're able to take the pieces, reassemble them, and make all sorts of different size and shape ruins, including mimicking competitive layouts if you'd like to. Their initial Kickstarter was rather well received, general reaction seemed to be quite good. This time around the thing that they're adding is the ability to have these pieces arrive pre-painted, something that not a lot of people are doing in the space at the moment, with a bunch of different cool machine painted designs on offer. Here are a few examples of those. There's things like a World War themed one, fancy patterned royal worlds, or blasted brickworks of a Forsaken world, all painted in pretty sturdy durable pigment on plastic pieces. Feel free to check them out, linked in the video description if you've got any interest, and otherwise I'll cycle back to them briefly at the end of the video. Getting back to the matter at hand though, as mentioned, Games Workshop basically announced new detachments for each and every faction in Warhammer 40k, so I'd guess that means the 26 major armies of the game. I guess that would include things like Black Templars and Blood Angels, as the various different supplements of Codex Space Marines. Kind of a nice way of guaranteeing that every single faction is at least somewhat interested, though I guess detachments might have more or less appeal if it winds up being something that's super niche and not an army that you've really collected out of your given faction. It might not necessarily have as much interest, but I feel like the anticipation is kind of cool, and generally expanding the different ways to play an army is kind of good, even if you might occasionally only use some of them for nothing but fun and fluffy games. The way they're going to be delivered is like a standard advent calendar, releasing from the 1st until the 24th of December. So 24 days worth of content. I'll certainly aim to cover them each as fast as possible on the channel. I'm not sure I'll be literally on the same day for every single one of them, but I'll hopefully be ready to go for the vast majority of them. Should be fun to explore all the cool new options. There'll be 30 different detachments and downloads within those 24 days, so on some days there's going to be more than one. It looks like 3 of the extra ones to account for will be ones for Chaos Demons. As I've said, they're going to be getting a slightly bumpier amount compared with the rest, which I'll focus on in a bit. And as well as Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar is going to be getting some sort of major rules content. I don't think they absolutely said that it would follow along with the same advent calendar download thing, though I wouldn't be too surprised if it did. Often when they've done sort of random scattergun rules releases and things for 40k, it's tended to either be narrative play only, or things that went straight to Warhammer Legends like datasheets for their limited edition miniatures. What's interesting for this one though is that it's fully match play legal, a genuine expansion to the core way that each army plays, and I feel like it's going to have a whole load of players interested both from a lore point of view and a seeing if the new detachment is strong point of view. The PDF documents, when they come out, are going to have the points available to them straight away. The points for the enhancements are going to be printed on the document, which I think is a very smart move, given that otherwise, if you wanted to use them in match play games with points, you'd have to wait until the next Munitorum field manual. I think if you're trying to make people excited about it and wait on the next release, the idea is that they're ready to go straight away, and I think that's actually really quite a good idea. And I stress that they can also be played in Crusade as well, basically just like any other detachment in the Codex. The other interesting thing that they confirmed with was that there will be no overlap between these detachments and Codex detachments. So basically, if your army's already got a Codex, it's not going to supersede any one detachment out of there. It's just going to be an extra expansion that you can use, but as it's 10th edition 40k, you can just completely play with the things in the Codex and ignore it. But also more interestingly than that, for the factions that don't have their codexes yet, this one's going to represent a detachment that won't come out in the codex and will play differently to any of the ones there. I'm sure they'll already have the vast majority of the rest of the codexes all drafted out and at least roughly ready to go, so know what themes are going to be in them and know which ones are going to be left out. Otherwise, for rules delivery, they said that they'd be added to the 40k app in January. I'd hope maybe at some point after the run's finished they might update the Munitorum field manual as well, just to consolidate all those points costs into one place and not have them lying around scattergun. In any case, it's pretty big news. It seems that with a major balance update plus all of these happening, Warhammer 40k on the other side of Christmas might look very different to how it does now. Beyond just the general rollout of the rules, we do have some hints and teasers as to what's actually going to be coming out in a few of them. In particular, they focused on Deathwatch, which sounds like it's going to be the single most major update out of any of these. That one's not just going to be a detachment, but an entire index. I'm not sure if they'd actually 100% confirmed that will be the case yet. I believe what they said in their previous teasers was that it'd be a way to field Deathwatch at full company level again, basically heavily implying that there'd be better rules for using them alongside more mainstream Codex Space Marine units, as was the case at the 10th edition launch. I'm not sure if they specifically said index though, even if it was kind of likely. I guess if they weren't having a standalone index, then it might just have been rules tweaks to Codex Agents of the Imperium, maybe having a unique detachment where it gives you specific rules as to what other Space Marine units can be included in it. But it seems they're going down the standalone index route again, so it looks like they might well have Codex Imperial Agents and also Index Deathwatch perhaps. And if that's really the way it works, I guess it means that we'd have essentially one more faction in mainstream 40k. I've talked about the release of this one a few times already. It's mainly to address the Deathwatch problem of having to make a painful choice. Either you can field them in their themed detachment, but you get locked out of any regular Space Marine kit, so things like Primaris units and everything else that Deathwatch players will have collected. Or you can basically give up on all the Deathwatch theming, you can't field their Ordo Xenos detachment, and you can only field some slightly sad versions of their units in a limited capacity, and then basically run those units allies to a Space Marine army running one of their detachments and painted black. So there's basically no real incentive to do so other than adding Deathwatch units into literally any other Imperial army. Given that they've confirmed it's an index, I feel like it's pretty likely to be at least fairly similar to what they had before Codex Agents of the Imperium came out. An index with their own detachment, their own unique units, and then basically being able to utilise all the bits out of core Codex Space Marines, maybe with a few units locked out that they have their own special versions of. I guess the biggest questions for that are whether it's going to differ too much from the original index they came out at 10th or just kind of a re-release. Will Games Workshop dare to bring any of the mixed kill teams back from Legends and put them in the index once more? I'm sure there'll be a lot of desire for them to do so, though maybe they'll just wait until they release some sort of Primaris kill team. I'm sure that'll happen at some point, even if not in the near future. And I guess otherwise, will they do something in the interim with the balance updates to address the state of Imperial agents, which is kind of bad right now? I feel like at least if Deathwatch were playable in that army, that'd be another fun way to get some use out of the models. Even if they do have the awkward limitations, at least having a bit of army strength will be at least a bit of a compromise. The other most interesting teaser that they gave was Chaos Demons, which actually maybe tells us a bit about their codex or lack of it. Rather than just having one detachment for Chaos Demons, instead of that they're going to get 4 different ones. Each of these 4 detachments is going to revolve around one of the Chaos deities, so Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh and Nurgle, which I think could be really quite interesting for Chaos Demon armies, giving you a reason to actually try and run Mono God, or at least going very heavily into one deity, even if you can still mix and match a few things. And I guess makes up a bit of the difference between the number of downloads versus the numbers of armies. They said there's 30 downloads, but there's only 26 armies in 40k, and only 24 days to release them in, so they have to make up a bit of time on the schedule somewhere. I guess if Deathwatch are going to be treated as a full faction again in a similar way to Agents of the Imperium, that's actually make 27 armies. So I guess if you did one for each of those 27 armies and then added in the extra 3 to Chaos Demons, you do make 30, I suppose. In any case, the unusual focus on the Sounds of the Dark Gods actually does feel like it might not be very good news for them getting a codex. As I talked about in a previous video, it does look like there have been a fair few rumours of the demons not getting a book in 10th edition, the idea being that their demonic deities might well be broken up into the deity legion codexes, so go along with, say, World Eaters or Thousand Suns, and have that be your main way to field demons of that particular god. The thing is, while this looks like it's great support for the different deities from this particular update, they did say that basically if they're releasing detachments in this update, then they wouldn't be out in the codex. So this basically seems like it's near enough a confirmation that if there was a Codex Chaos Demons, it wouldn't feature detachments for Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh and Nurgle, and that just seems very, very unlikely to me. If I'd had to imagine what a Codex for Chaos Demons might be, it'd probably be some sort of undivided detachment, one detachment for each of the deities, and then maybe a Bellicor detachment perhaps. It just feels like if they were getting a Codex, then they wouldn't have released basically most of the contents of it all in this digital update. Maybe releasing something like a Bellicor detachment or perhaps a Horde-focused detachment or something different could have been another way to go. Releasing the actual deity ones that you'd guess would be in the codex just feels a bit suspect to me. On the other hand though, if they are releasing these detachments and they do indeed stick around until the end of 10th edition, I guess it might safeguard them as their own playable faction. I guess for the individual deities, if they persist, it might be all that you need. Though I guess if the individual deities did go into different codexes, it might be more that you just can't field undivided demons and you can still field any one deities on their own. Either way though, in the meantime it should give a real big lease of life into that faction. This feels like basically all you'd get in a codex anyway really, an undivided detachment that they already have, plus ways to play the 4 deities. Feels pretty cool in the interim. Next up, they specifically called out the Astra Militarum as having a detachment that will be different from their upcoming codex. That was just as an example to illustrate the point mentioned earlier, but also does have me wondering as to what that last detachment could be. They announced that the Guard ones would be a combined regiment, an artillery force, a tank force, a sort of stealthy recon infantry type force, and a mechanised force. And on looking at those detachments for the first time, my initial reaction was, where's the Scion one? They're the exact sort of subclass within a codex that I'd strongly suspect would get a detachment of their own, in the similar way to Harlequins are getting one for the Eldari, or Crews got one for Tau. Tempestor Scions had their own standalone codex once upon a time, so they seem like a bit of a no-brainer for a detachment focused on them. With the announcement of a 6th mystery detachment for the Guards, it does make me wonder if that'll be the Scion one, and if so I'll reserve the right to be a little bit smug if that does turn out to be right, as that was my first thought when I heard that news. I definitely feel like there's enough other themes that they could dig into with the Guard though. I feel like that's the majority of the archetypes within the codex. I feel like maybe one of the more obvious ones that's missing might be just a more standard foot guard one. They had a sort of vaguely minister and priest focused infantry company in the past. I feel like just a standard one would go down kind of well though. Unless the main way to play infantry guard is going to be the sort of vaguely Tanith sounding stealthy infantry company, which still could be an interesting way to play guard on foot to be fair. In general though, I think it's pretty fun to speculate as to what other factions might get. I feel like for the ones that don't have codexes yet, maybe things perhaps could be a bit more obvious. There's obviously themes that they haven't delved into for all the unreleased things, so lots more content that they could explore there. I feel like perhaps the Orcs are one of the armies that have the most flavours of different themed army. Maybe something like a Battle Wagon Blitz Brigade could be a fun one. That's quite commonly been a formation or rule subset in the past, and they don't really have a detachment that's quite so heavily focused on transports. I guess the Cult of Speed can do some things. Maybe that could be a fun one focused on battle wagons with big death rollers and things. Otherwise, though, perhaps a more sensible choice might be a more generic shooting detachment. That felt like it was one that was kind of missing when the Codex came out to represent Bad Moons. It would be fun if they had some sort of rules to make standard shooter boys well worth it, and perhaps things like flash kits that don't really feel like they have a detachment particularly tailored to them right now. You could do Blood Axe Commandos or Freebooters as well, maybe as a couple of other options. For sisters, maybe they could do something like a more melee-focused Bloody Rose one. That was a much-loved one in the past, mainly due to the rules power. But it would be fun to have something to support melee in the same way as the Bringers of Flame supports range. The Penitent Host does a bit, but is locked to some very specific units. For Space Marines, if they wanted to stick to exploring sort of common archetypes defined by chapters, they could do things like successor chapters such as a Flesh Terrors focused one or a Crimson Fist themed one. A crazy amount of other possibilities that they could do with standard Space Marines, though. They've got a ridiculous unit roster. For Chaos Marines, again, if they wanted to go down that kind of theme, you could do something like Creations of Bile, or maybe an Allied with Be'lakor style one, or even something digging into other Renegade Warbands or Fallen Dark Angels. It maybe didn't enormously feel like Pact-bound Zealots really did Word Bearers all that much justice as well. It'd be quite nice to have one that's focused around Masters of Possession, Possessed, and Dark Apostles maybe. For Tau, maybe they could have a sort of Fish of Fury armoured and transport one, or perhaps one that's like a combined arms detachment in the same way as Custodes have Talons of the Emperor, one that might synergize with one that could work for Kroot allies going alongside Tau, as opposed to primarily focusing on the Kroots as their detachment does. I feel like that could be quite a nice one for, say, people who enjoy Delith, and I'm sure Games Workshop want to push their new Kroot models as much as possible. In any case, certainly feels like an interesting way to deliver a rules update. One of the things that did occur to me is that it's quite nice to get this free as a content drop, as opposed to how Games Workshop would have done this in the past, and that would be to release it in a whole bunch of campaign books and supplements that they expect you to pay for. That's certainly what happened during, say, early 9th edition, where they had near enough the same sort of content and idea of this, but dispensed it as different parts of their Warzone campaign books. Kind of feels bad purchases where you'd only use a few pages if you actually just wanted the rules from the official source. I think definitely worth noting that each time it happens, just to make sure they don't go back to the former. I did wonder as well whether or not this was planned from the start of 10th edition. Did they go out with the mindset of releasing the codexes and then thinking we'll have a big break between the codexes, then do a really big content drop to have people motivated to play 40k? Maybe no doubt buy a few models to fit into their new detachment if they want to, and then get out with rolling the rest of the codexes out for the rest of the edition. I feel like it'd look kind of deliberate if, say, they come out with a Scion one for the Guard. That one in particular would strike me as one that probably should have been in the codex, but they've decided to keep for this update. I guess we'll see on that front though. Maybe it was that way round, or maybe it was a choice to boost interest to a game, which has maybe one of its main talking points out on the internet being that it's a little bit on the bland side. At least maybe taking over as one of the chief complaints, as it's harder to complain about balance than it was. With random detachments being put out for index downloads though, it might add a little bit to rule source bloat, which is already something that people have complained about in 10th edition. Certainly in the big Pariah Nexus updates, they had a vast amount of documents that took a while to get your head around. Throwing an extra 30 downloads into the mix probably isn't going to help with that, though I feel like the way that they're doing these ones, at least compared with some of the other supplemental things they've done in the past, perhaps aren't the very worst. Unlike, say, updates in certain things like, say, 8th edition Psychic Awakening, they're not really core rules that you'll use in every single game if you're using a certain model. These detachment rules will only be used if you're actually choosing to run that detachment and pass up the other ones that you could take. So I guess in theory you're either using this or your codex detachments, not both, which doesn't feel like it'd be the most onerous thing. Finally, I do wonder how much effort they're going to put into balancing these if they wind up being weak. I think one thing that's actually kind of strong during 10th edition is that they haven't just released attachments and then forgotten about them if they're bad. Maybe that has happened to some of them, but at least a good few of them they've given repeated improvements to. Things like trying to make the Divergent Space Marine chapter detachments actually worth playing versus the core codex, which a lot weren't at the start, or giving some small rules boost to things like Auric Champions or Crusher Stampede at the last one, just to try and encourage a little bit of diversity and not have everyone just stick to the same obviously best detachment. I feel like the more detachments they add to the game, the more their effort is going to be spread amongst a vast amount and more going to get forgotten. But anyway, I hope that if they do release these and make some cool rules, they actually do a bit of support for them if they don't wind up being any good at the start. Otherwise it might just wind up being a bit of a nothing burger for certain factions, Sure, you've got some new themed rules in a download, but you're not really going to use them because you might not have the exact models that you need, or they might just be so bad that you wouldn't want to run them versus another detachment if you're going to be playing against an army that's kind of strong and he needs to bring something at least okay. In any case though, it's looking kind of interesting for the 40k rules updates. Let me know your thoughts on them down in the comments below, and what are your hopes and fears for your own faction with this update. As mentioned, I'll certainly be looking forward to covering them here on the channel. Looks like December is going to be a particularly busy time with all of the updates to make. Finally, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Futureproof Modular Terrain. As mentioned earlier, they've got their terrain system that you can build up and break down, and has a Kickstarter running at the moment. The Kickstarter's running until the 5th of December. They currently have a bunch of early bird discounts to get things a little bit cheaper than otherwise, and they're launching their range with some pre-painted pigmented terrain. In theory, a battlefield that you can build up and break down, and is already painted before you've even started. The range is made around these bits, which between multiple copies of them you can assemble the vast majority of ruins that you might want to. Lots of big 3-story things if you'd like. They go together with like building blocks and they're made of plastic. And just in general, out of the pros and cons they might want to take off out of a terrain system, they do really quite a lot. You could break them down and store them in a small space. Changing the designs and layouts is pretty fun. They are actually textured terrain pieces, unlike certain things like MDF or cheaper plastic things, and having the option to come painted can save some hobby work. They're still cheaper than Games Workshop, and they're generally kind of functional for playing 40k. Line of sight blocking ruins are sort of essential for 10th balance. For the downsides of it, they're a bit pricier than some MDF and 3D printed options. They aren't the very cheapest alternative terrain set on the market, and more so if you're going for the painted options. This is of course a Kickstarter, and as always with those, there's at least some chance that issues might not arise till later. They do have one successful one under their belt, but if something arises with problems with manufacturing, there could be delays or things, so certainly bear that in mind. I feel like while you are able to reconfigure the terrain, I'm not sure I'd be doing it myself on a massively crazy fast basis, though it may be nice enough if you want to build a themed board or make some different structures for a new terrain set. In any case, their primary offering is this one, a full table set for $240 or 300 painted, roughly £240 or €290. They have a half table set as well, basically half the stuff for half the price near enough. And then for painting options they have a rates table. There's basic designs like the Desert, Shrine World or Martian designs here, which I still think look rather cool. And then fancier designs that cost a little bit extra, the fun sandbagged one or the blasted brickwork ones from earlier. They've got roof and base expansions too, if you do want a few more options and a few more building blocks to put together. And the idea is that they'll ship out in April, paying between $15 and $30 depending on where you are in the world, though customs included in the shipping price. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave a link to their page in the video description. In any case though, let me know what you make of 40k's impending big updates, and feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the videos coming with new ones out just about every day. Looking forward to covering those detachments when we get them. Check out the Patreon page and the discount affiliate links in the video description if you'd like to support the channel, and a massive thank you to any who are doing so, but otherwise an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.